Slaking is when you're letting the plaster just absorb as much water as possible.
He's very passionate about this. The body of Christ. Yeah, those respirators, if you have like a ponytail or if you're a girl with long hair, it's no bueno.
Some fresh water, a clean drill.
He's like me, we don't have that concern.
And we just get in there. And
our ponytail days are over.
I just use a steady, even mixing speed.
Unless I go to Turkey.
Fully
I'm hearing stories that I could bring this hairline down. Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome back to another mold reaction video. We're continuing with Van Tiki Studios. He had just made some master molds and now he's going to fill them with plaster. And I want to see if there's any side view take on the process. So let's get into it. I like xylophones.
Hey, it is a long overdue episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday in which we will continue the adventure of the rhinoceros hornbill. Now, if you recall episode 1, we sculpted it. In episode 2, we made the plaster master mold. And in episode 3, we made these silicone master molds. Now, this episode, episode 4, we are going to use these silicone master molds to make our production plaster molds. And we're going to need a lot of them. We're going to need like 10 of these things. And
okay, so I'm not talking like you said.
Gone ahead and made
you can talk. No. Here, like, you can talk over him.
While I made these,
the math.
They have what's called IDO Day, Immediate Decision Option, which you take your portfolio in and it's thumbs up or thumbs down. I went in to sit with the guy. He's got some records in front of him and he said, okay, Michael, what do we got today? He said, what? Your ACT scores are not really great. I said, what are you talking about? I said, how do you have my ACT scores? Well, they're all right here. I took that test as a joke with a friend of mine in high school. When they said that the scores don't follow you, we sat down in the auditorium and finished this test first and make everybody else insecure. We sat down and just filled out any answers. And I remember turning in the paper to whatever teacher there was there to collect them. And they're like, you finished? I said, yeah, it was no problem, you know. And I just walked out. I knew it was a joke. I'm saying, can I see the test scores? I have a negative score in math. He laughs and he goes, I didn't know that was possible.
Took careful notes on the amounts of plaster used. Sometimes you mix up too much, sometimes you mix up too little, and I wanted to find the exact amount needed to cast these molds. Once I got that magical amount, I went ahead and wrote it down on all of the mold boxes.
Yeah, we just used to weigh our molds.
For 2 reasons. One, I'm going to be having
plaster was not too expensive, so we would.
In the future, in this production run, I'll get to that part later. And also, just so that
this is important, writing the obvious.
Now,
seems like you wouldn't need to, but again, when you have 100 of these things floating around your shop,
plaster math,
and you can't catalog them correctly or send someone else to find them. Oh, he's got the nice graphics again.
Uses 9 pounds of plaster. Side B.
I'm going to get through this though.
9 pounds of plaster. And
no, I'm not.
The base piece and the plug piece combined. Each mold uses 22.5 pounds of plaster. I'm going to need not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 50-pound bags of pottery plaster. Before
those are 100-pound bags.
I start to transfer the plaster into these 2 5-gallon plastic buckets. I like to keep the plaster in here because it's easy to get to, and I put these
yeah, that's my breath. So I don't know that it's really necessary to transfer the plaster, and the moisture sensitivity issues really only I ever experienced when the bag was open for a long time. The plaster paper bag has a plastic liner inside, so it was not so moisture sensitive until you open it, as I just said. It was more about if it sat there a long time, it would get what we call packing lumps. But we would blow through the plaster so quick that I wasn't ever worried about the moisture contamination, even in the humid studio here in Illinois.
Airtight lids on top of these buckets, which keeps the plaster nice.
Oh, maybe it is a 50-pound bag.
To suck up water, so when I'm not using the plaster, I keep it in its original bags. But even then, it's not quite that safe. So I only keep as much plaster in the studio as I'm going to use so that it doesn't slowly suck moisture out of the air while it's sitting in storage. I also like to make sure that I'm getting fresh plaster from my ceramic supply store. Also, before we start, I have to recommend The Essential Guide to Mold Making and Slip Casting by Andrew Martin.
So this is an older book. I think on Amazon, I reviewed this years ago, probably around 2003. I reviewed all the mold making books that were on the market at the time. And it was kind of fun. So I read them all, and I can't say I remember them all, but I was into it.
This is my source for plaster ratios, and I will put a link to it in the description of the video. So here is everything we need to get started. An empty bag for old plaster, a water bucket, a mixing bucket on top of a very accurate digital scale, plaster easily accessible inside of buckets. I've got my mixer with a squirrel mixer blade.
I wouldn't use the squirrel wheels. We'll have to roll the thing about the plaster mixing disc. Whoa, you don't mix plaster like that. This is how you mix drywall mud. What's happening is they're putting in a lot of air here. Use the plaster mixing disc. I've talked about that in other videos. I'm going to show you how to make one. So what you see here is a caked up threaded rod. It's kind of a 1/4-20 rod, which is enough. And then this is a sanding disc, a buffing disc there's a wing nut here, and it's just been mounted to this rod. And when it spins, you see that wobble? That is ideal. If it cakes up a little bit, so what? You know, and it's not a problem. I think those squirrel wheels throw a lot of air into the mix, and then that in turn shortens the life of the plaster, because in the other video you heard him talk about how the surface would degrade, and if you make a whippy air mix of plaster, you're weakening the plaster, and that problem happens. And so if you forensic this backwards, a part of that issue can come from the wrong mixing blade because it's being overmixed. His molds would last longer with the right mixer. That's my theory.
I'll put a link to that in the description. Water for cleaning, a little bucket for cleaning.
He's set up. That's
and
nice.
Of course, the molds. We're going to need our molds for casting. I've got a vibrating table. I'll put a link to that also too, and we'll talk about it some more in a little bit. I have got Windex water and alcohol and more molds.
It just makes it look like mixing plaster is really complicated, and it's not. I just had a bag, sink. You know, it was very simple, but he's very precise for the camera.
Yeah, I think we can do this now. Okie dokie, so we are going to mix up the first batch.
Can I turn the volume up a little? Is it okay?
Yeah.
See, I just checked to make sure I'm getting the right amount of water and plaster. Doing the base piece and the little
Now I
molds.
can hear.
Those are the two small molds closest to the camera right now. I am using ice cold fresh water.
The plaster mixing techniques, there's a science to it, and there's a casualness to it. Some people will say, oh, you just kind of feel your way towards it like you're spelunking in a dark cave, but as long as you follow the ratio of plaster mixing, you'll be pretty good. I was very successful with 1 gallon of water to 11 pounds of plaster. Now, I did not use ice cold water. I thought that slowed the batch too much. I would use room temperature. The other thing that I would do to increase the strength of my plaster is I would add 1 pound of hydrocal into that, so it would actually be 12 pounds of material. And that hydrocal did not interfere with the absorptive quality of the plaster, and I did gain a little bit of strength. You could probably push that ratio too and get more strength out of your molds. This will help you have to make less of them in the beginning.
Plaster is dependent on temperature. The warmer the water, the faster your plaster sets. Once again, I'm double checking my plaster amount.
This is a personal call, but I never wore those respirators for mixing plaster. I had an exhaust fan with the filter, and I would wear a face mask just for particulates. And this, I don't know if those has organic cartridges in it, but it gets a little expensive. Maybe he's sensitive to the dust. The other thing that I would do is with that now after COVID, we all know them as N95 masks, but they can get kind of scuzzy pretty quick. So all I would do is I would take a piece of Kleenex, I would put it in the mask, and then I would wear my mask like this. So that mask actually didn't get all breath, humidity, and bad, and it saved on the trouble. And then when I was done, I would take that mask and I would put it in a container, because otherwise just dust from the shop is settling to the inside of that mask. If you wear these respirators that have this kind of silicone vinyl face fitting, you're putting a lot of humidity into that with every breath. And if you take it off, it's going to be sweaty in there, and you got to wipe it out with some alcohol, otherwise you get some it just gets nasty. You just don't want to put it back on your face.
By looking at the handy dandy notations on the thing, I zero out the scale.
Just exhaust and you would be good.
Sift in the plaster. You don't want to dump it in one big clump. You want to gently sift this plaster.
Yeah, you should be able to get all of your plaster in your water in about 2 minutes.
Hydrated better that way, and the more you agitate the plaster putting it in, the faster it will set.
He's got some high ceilings.
As much working time as we possibly can. Okay, so we're going to let that slake in there. And slaking is when you're letting the plaster just absorb as much water as possible.
He's very passionate about this. The body of Christ.
You won't get a good, just a really good set thing of plaster at the end. I don't know how to.
Okay, so slaking, here's how it works, is you've heard me say it before, every little particle of plaster is encapsulated by a tiny little bubble of air, if you will. And if you don't let it sit in the water bucket long enough, the water's not permeating that entrapped air that you can't really see. And what happens is then if you mix too soon, you have dry material in the middle of your snowball, so to speak, and then you've just surrounded it with wet plaster. And then when that makes a lumpy plaster mix, and when you pour it into your master mold, you have a weaker mix that will flake off if one of those not well slaked pieces of plaster hits the surface. That's where you'll get that mold wear faster. So mixing plaster well with a good slake and a good mixing disc is very important to the longevity of your mold. I think he's doing a few things maybe that contribute to a shorter mold life. It's just a suspicion.
Say this, your plaster is not gonna be as creamy and nice when you mix it up. You just wanna really let it hydrate. And don't worry, it will not set up while it is slaking. I have heard people say that you can, if you gently sift the plaster into the bucket, you can let it slake for almost, I don't know, like a long time. You don't have to worry about it. I'm only gonna slake this for about 2 minutes, and then I'm gonna start mixing it for 1 minute. Now these mixing...
3 minutes was my rule, but it really depended on the amount of dry plaster.
And my studio environment, you'll have to experiment on your own if you're doing this. Do some practice batches, see what works. Oh, time to go.
If you put your plaster in the bucket and you just keep adding it to the middle, it's going to take longer to slake. I would take a small cup and I would put it evenly around the water surface. And it's counterintuitive to people saying, oh, I'm mixing by island, which is they pour it in and say, until you see the mound. I wouldn't do that. I would always go with the ratio and disperse it equally, and your slake time will be short and very effective.
Okay, so we are going to be using...
Yeah, those respirators, if you have like a ponytail or if you're a girl with long hair, it's just no bueno.
Some fresh water. If you have any old plaster on the bit, it will actually accelerate the plaster setting. So you want a clean drill.
He's like me, we don't have that concern.
And we just get in there. And
our ponytail days are over.
I just use a steady, even mixing speed.
Unless I go to Turkey.
Plaster fully hydrated.
I'm hearing stories that I could bring this hairline down.
A little bump to get the bubbles out. I'm going to give it a quick spritz of it.
I'll have to make more than $3 on YouTube.
Surface bubbles.
That'll be, okay, so this is what YouTube's gonna do when I get enough money. You'll see me with hair. That means we monetized. The dude showed up with hair, things are going well.
Angle, I find I capture.
Okay, we just missed the thing because I was bullshitting.
We'll buy you a wig. It's fine.
Yeah?
So people think we're successful.
Okay. Well, we have success in other ways, but this is a different thing. Now, he sprayed a surfactant on there, I think it's called, somebody corrected me one time. Just a little bit of water would do the good. Windex, fine, whatever. Just get a little moisture on the surface of your silicone mold.
Bubbles this way.
It breaks the tension.
Which makes it really weird to pour. So just bear with me.
Oh my God, this is very fussy. I've never poured plaster like that. He has a lot of love right now for that plaster, and I'm beginning to think that he just doesn't want anything to go wrong because he's so invested, but you don't need to pour plaster like this at an angle or things like that. Just have your master mold leveled, pour it in, use a little chip brush to get in there and push it around on the surface, and you'll be fine. Not everybody has this kind of leverage, right? That's why I mention these things, is he does it his way, he's good, but
Steady.
his table's nice and tall. But my pouring tables were actually low. My crafting tables were high because the lower table I could pour down into.
So I can level the mold out, make sure it's all seated properly.
I would pour it on a workboard unless you have a dedicated mold table, and it needs to be something that rocks a little bit.
Bubbles on the surface of the plaster.
Doesn't matter.
Don't panic, we'll take care of them.
Surface bubbles don't really matter. You'll clean that up later.
Base plug.
And that reach is tricky too.
The lowest part of the mold and let the plaster rise up from there. Slowly, you want to let that surface tension just work its way through, forcing any bubbles out. Plaster's heavy, it's heavier than the air, so it's going to want to force.
Yeah, he's got good arms. Takes some time.
I've stopped filling it just before the top because we're going to do this.
Yeah, a good mold table you can shake.
You don't need to buy a fancy vibrating table. You can make your own. But the vibrating table is nice. The last step is topping off the molds, filling them to the very edge with the last bit of plaster and getting rid of those surface bubbles.
Yeah, don't overfill them.
There we go. this extra plaster will go back into the bag that we left open from filling the buckets. A handy dandy tip is to use the empty bag of plaster.
Okay, so I have a different handy dandy tip. My handy dandy tip, if you're a ceramist, is to make something that's useful to you. Maybe slump molds are good for you, maybe you need plaster, wedging slabs. And I would have, if you need the wedging slab, just keep a box of cardboard cut to, a height of 2.5, 3 inches, and just take your excess plaster and dump it into that cardboard box. You just need to tape the seal on the bottom. And also, after you have poured it into the cardboard box, or a bowl if you're making a slump mold, then you rotate your bucket so it leaves a coating inside your bucket, and you leave that coating and you set it aside. As that plaster sets, you'll crack it out like an eggshell. And I saw that he washes his buckets out. It's extra work.
Plaster to store already mixed up plaster. It's a waterproof bag, and you can put it all,
You'll get a real heavy bag to take into the trash, not a big deal, but I like to make see, I would have just rolled it.
That was close. You can put all of that plaster into here, and it's a great way to just store that set plaster. Once you've got it out of the bucket, be sure to...
What happens is that bucket that he's rinsing into eventually builds up sediment on the bottom, and then you got to pour off the water somewhere in your yard, and then let that cake at the bottom dry out. And in your own shop, it's no big deal, but if you're in a studio that you share, it gets kind of scuzzy because people will add clay to it and it gets a little moldy. I don't like this rinsing of buckets. I would just have enough buckets.
Clean it really well. I use this separate bucket of water to avoid getting a lot of plaster into my drain.
I had the separate bucket of water for rinsing my mixing disc.
You want to take it to the sink.
I wouldn't do that.
Thorough rinse out. You want to make sure that this thing is
there you go.
clean, because
still not my recommended.
In the bucket, it will accelerate the next batch of plaster.
So
always
it will. If residual plaster, I always was taught that too, that it will accelerate it, but it was never too much. I think that really what accelerates it is mixing a longer power mixing sets it really fast, not so much the residual in the bucket.
Okay, so we're about to do the larger batch for the big half of the mold here. And I'm going to be using 3 quarts of water, 9 pounds of plaster, and it's going to slake for 2 minutes. I'm giving this one a 2-minute slake because it's a lot of plaster, a lot of water. Yeah, so I gotta get back to it. For this larger batch, we're using a larger container. I'm using kind of a big, I think this is a 2-gallon clear bucket I got from a restaurant supply store. I love using these for mixing plaster. They are fantastic. And yes, I am timing this on my watch while I mix. I mix for a specific amount of time. If you mix it for too long, it will set faster. Once the mixing is complete, I knock out any of the large air bubbles, and I get rid of surface bubbles with a quick spritz of alcohol. Next up, it's time to prepare the mold with my Windex water mix. This kind of...
So he's got this vibration table, which is kind of cute, and I had a vibration table for a while. It was a floor-mounted one that had these little air suspension things that you could adjust, and a rheostat that allowed you to adjust the frequency. It was a pretty nice table. But the thing is if he's pouring on his vibration table, not on a workboard, once this mold is full of plaster, he can't move it anywhere else, and he can't use that vibration table for anything else. And if that vibration table is not level, he's committed to it. He can't pick that up with wet plaster too easily.
Breaks the surface tension on the silicone, and then, hear that? That is the vibrating table in action.
It's neat, but you really don't need them.
Variety of vibration cycles.
You can use a chip brush.
It makes any bubbles find their way to the surface of the plaster, and it really helps this plaster flow over the surface of the silicone without capturing any bubbles.
No comment.
Fantastic. As you can see, I am pouring in a very slow and steady fashion. I start filling the model at the lowest point first, and let's let the plaster rise up slowly.
It's very slow.
Over the sculpture, or the mold of the sculpture, I should say. You just don't want to rush this. Once it is complete, I'll just tell you right now what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm actually going to move this over here to make room for the next mold before this plaster sets. That's why I didn't fill it up all the way. Gives me a little bit of wiggle room to kind of just carefully get my fingers under here, and hopefully...
he just needed a workboard.
The word that you know and love, a hashtag plaster disaster.
Ooh, hashtag.
This is heavy.
A simple thing would have prevented all that.
Always an adventure, and the most critical part is once I get it onto the new table, I want to make sure that the jacket, the wooden frame that's around the piece, is settled properly, and then I knock all of the air bubbles out before I fill the mold to the very rim. And of course,
Okay.
the very last
Good
step
job.
is grabbing that little alcohol spray bottle and getting rid of
Never
the
did that.
surface bubbles. There we go. Okay, so these larger mold sections use a lot more plaster, and I've got the volume dialed in perfectly. So
Okay, in your mixing buckets, if you don't have that whole technique about cracking out the bucket, meaning rolling it into the box, and if your bucket doesn't compress, you can't do that technique. The culinary mixing containers are kind of durable. Some of them have different densities and will collapse a little bit, and others won't. So just think of that in advance. Get a bucket that'll flex without cracking. If it's too brittle, you're out. You'll go through a lot of buckets.
almost zero waste.
I would have rolled it.
Aha! Now, if you're watching this and wondering why for the smaller mold sections I had so much extra plaster, couldn't I just mix up a smaller batch? I could, but plaster gets weird when you mix it in smaller volumes. It just sets differently. I like the consistency and the timing of...
I like that he's taking the time to mention this because ratios as you get in a smaller batch become more and more critical. You know, you mix 100 pounds of something and 10% of, let's just say 100 pounds dried, 10 pounds water, you can be off a few ounces and it's no problem. But if you're 1 pound and a 16th, whatever, 10% of that ratio kicks it off out of a comfort zone pretty quickly. I jumbled my words there, but basically small batches are more fussy than large batches, and he's right, you can mess it up.
A larger batch of plaster. So the batch that I mixed up to do the small plugs is the smallest that I'm comfortable making. Yes, I do end up having to throw away like a third of it. I feel guilty about it.
Pour the extra plaster in something else.
Better quality mold in the end. Hey, we're back at the cleaning station, and this is where we're going to get all of that extra plaster residue out of the mixing bucket. You do not want any of this stuff ever to go down your drain. And that is why we're using...
You're screwed if it's in your drain.
Separate cleaning
It'll
bucket.
set underwater.
I highly recommend doing this in your studio and also getting a plaster trap, which we will talk about in a little bit, I promise. Again, I do a final, thorough, clean, sponge down.
I just wouldn't do it with any bit of water. I just never used water in my plaster buckets for that.
But we want to get the plaster out of this bucket. A common mistake people make is letting plaster residue build up in their mixing buckets, and that will completely accelerate the plaster when you mix your next batch. So get that bucket completely clean.
It won't accelerate it too much.
Now
I never
that the
experienced
bucket was
that.
clean, I could mix up the final batch
Okay,
of plaster
that's fun to
for the
watch.
final big
He's got
piece.
that line detail. If you just have that chip
In
brush
action, the
and you kind of
vibrating
brush
table
along that line
and
detail,
the
you'll get some
spray
really
that's
good
working in tandem
coverage
to
without the
avoid
vibration
any air
table.
bubbles as the plaster
But this is next level.
slowly spreads its way across the surface of the mold. Now, the nice thing about this being the very last piece I'm pouring is I don't have to move it off of the plaster casting.
Here's the thing. A lot of people that are into ceramics and plaster mold making are really into it because of the simplicity of the process. They don't need a lot of special tools. They don't want all this power stuff. And the way he's showing it introduces a lot of tools and tricks and things like this. But ceramicists, the ones that I've known, are very earthy, simple kind of process thinkers. You know, use your hands. You don't need a toolbox. You need 3 tools type of people. And this is a beautiful teaching, but it complicates the studio.
Well, I can just leave it here, which means I can fill it up to the very rim.
It's his comfort zone, but most people
Full set of mold pieces
wouldn't be this tidy.
sit for about 45 minutes to an hour so they can go through their chemical reaction and turn hard. Plaster goes through an exothermic reaction, which means it gives off a lot of heat while it's set. So that's a good way
Yeah, don't body cast with plaster if you don't know that. You'll burn your skin.
You'll feel once it's going to set up, it's going to turn hard to the touch, but it will not be strong. It's going to go through several stages. It's going to go through like a thickening stage, where it's going to be like a milkshake, and then it's going to turn into like curdled milk. And then it's actually going to seem pretty firm, but it's still going to be cool to the touch. But then it will start to get really hot.
I mean, you pour plaster and you're going to get all this. I mean, if you're never going to pour plaster, it's fascinating to know what's happening, but you do it once and you got it.
Once it has hit peak temperature and starts to cool, you're safe to open these things up, which we will do shortly. A half an hour, and I have a fancy space thermometer, and we can check the temperatures of the molds. Okay, so the tabletop is at 75 degrees. The first
This guy.
board is at 85.
I mean, you got to love the commitment.
Yeah.
But, I mean, damn it. It's like eating dinner with 6 forks, 9 knives, 3 spoons, 6 glasses. I mean, just give me some chopsticks.
In the very last mold that we poured,
I never did this.
At 95. It is quite toasty to touch. I'm gonna give this.
I would have one of those thermometers on my nightstand. My wife always takes the blanket, and I'm at the point where I need evidence of this. And so at night I would take the temperature, photo document,
Just a little
complain
bit
in the
more time
morning.
before we open it up. Okay.
Probably not a good idea.
Now, this one is definitely on the cooling end. It's still warm to the touch, but I can tell it's gone over the peak of maximum hot, so I'm just gonna start opening it. I usually like to open these in the order that I want to assemble the mold. This is the bottom piece of the mold, so I'm gonna open this one first and clean it.
Open it.
For the smaller molds, like a thin one like this, I sometimes don't even have to take apart the frame. I can just push it right out. We'll have to take apart the frame for the larger ones.
He's a lovable guy, but I'm getting a little impatient.
Plaster. While it's at its peak high temperature, it actually expands a little bit. So it'll be harder to take them out when they're hot. If I let them wait until they're cool, it will then contract back to the actual size.
For those of you who know I Dream a Genie.
But you can go either way. Just have to know. Weird plaster facts.
Okay. He loves the process. You gotta.
This side, not so much. There's a really yucky edge.
That piece is too thin. I would have made it about 3 times as thick. I think a small piece like that is delicate.
Make sure that this mold handle well.
Oh, it's a very small footprint there. Okay.
The initial shaping work with this tool, it's called a Sureform tool, and it's like a woodworking tool. You'll find it in any kind of Home Depot type store. And I make sure I capture all of the plaster.
I would shave over the trash can, not the wet plaster.
Bucket. From then, once I've got the edges nice and beveled, we move on to the fine sanding step.
Yeah, you need a wire
For
brush.
sanding, I use this drywall sandpaper. You can find it also in any home store. And it doesn't
I never did this for production molds, only for molds that I was about to make a master of.
Designed for. And
It's just a little.
and the whole bottom.
I need a thesaurus for the word fussy for this video, because I keep saying fussy, and he deserves higher credible words because he's very precise. I think he has a science background.
It's just some really kind of strange
just a guess.
corners, and it would just be very difficult for me to reach in there with the Sureform tool. So I just use a little, I think it's called a fettling knife.
It is called a fettling knife.
And that's
The fettling knife, you can cut the tip, otherwise the blades are too long.
And then from there, I go on to just.
I always used to cut about 3 inches off the tip, and then it was a nice, durable knife.
I triple check those marks and notches that I put on there to make absolutely sure that I orient the
Well played.
the plywood jackets. Okay, so we're gonna get into the bigger pieces, and these sometimes I have to open up the wooden frame on. I only just open one corner, and that usually gets me enough wiggle room to get the silicone out of the wooden jacket. Oh, and they are heavy.
So the question for a viewer to me would have been, well, if you're using an acrylic mold box instead of a wooden box, and that acrylic box goes away after you make the mold, how are you supporting the silicone after you pour? Well, remember I was saying that I was going to use urethane, and I would just use a stiff enough urethane like the 7440. That's decades ago. I don't know if that's still a workhorse material, but the sidewalls here on his mold, if you have too soft a silicone and no wooden piece, they'll kind of bag out. The thing is it won't distort your mold because those are outside edges. They're not detail surfaces, and it won't cramp your style too much. But in essence, I would pour all of my molds back to back, so one wall was touching another, and they would kind of self-support each other, and then just put a piece of wood or something. It was very easy, a little bit of, pickup truck style, but.
This is where the Craig Jig pocket screws really shine. They are just extremely easy to back out.
He must be tired at the end of the day.
Hard on the mold, and then put them right back in, and they hold things nice, tight, and square. Yeah, this is a great time to talk about why we have the lines here and the arrows here, because once this rubber's out, it's hard
Wait, he talked about that all the way.
which way this frame was sitting and which side connected to where. So that's why I like to put more information on this than I think I'll ever need, just to be safe.
Safe. Dude, his whole life looks safe.
We cleaned up the edges of the big pieces just like we did on the smaller pieces, first with the Sureform and then with that fancy drywall sandpaper.
Just do that over a trash can.
And once we get all the edges nice and clean, it's time to assemble the first mold.
Once.
All right.
Twice, maybe.
We have got production mold number.
Yeah, he pre-laid the strap. That was thoughtful.
My goal is to get 3 of these cast a day. So at the end of today, tomorrow, and the day after, I will have 9 molds combined with the 2 that we've already poured for a total of 10 production molds.
Well done. Where was his registration key? Why does he have that key there? He's got right here something. It looks like it was a design change or something.
Why am
I don't know.
strapping these closed? I'm glad you asked. Plaster can warp while it's drying. This is going to go through a long, even though it's
Super helpful tip. Strap your molds tight when they're wet and let them dry
to fully
like that.
dry out and to fully cure. And during that time, it can warp a little bit if you don't hold it together. So
He's fancy with the strap fold back. I used to just label the straps and cut them and keep them for that mold if it was a production run. The straps were only like a couple bucks each.
So
what happens is if that strap end is too long, this sounds fussy, but it makes the strap easier to come off of the mold. But when you cut it short, there's nothing that can grab it and you can accidentally pop the mold open. But it only happened, in 30 years, it only happened a couple times.
Not once, not twice, but oh my God, we're going to need to make 10
He still didn't use a work board.
Guess what? Because I like you all so much, I'm not going to make you watch me do it all 10 times. Today, perhaps I'll just do a vignette, a highlight reel, if you will. If I think of a little tip or technique or something that I didn't talk about yesterday.
This guy's committed to
I'll shoot it really quick today and we will stop.
So I can't watch the videos.
How's that sound?
They're very...
Always ask me, what ratio do I mix up?
I'm getting used to it in a way.
Bubble sauce?
Adjusted, rather.
I don't really have an exact answer.
It's not as bad as when I looked at it for the first time.
The Windex,
But
like
with the video, you can't teach everything in one video.
That's true. That's why it's got 5 parts.
quarter? I guess that
parts.
might be like a quarter.
There's 5
maybe
parts to
1/4 Windex
this process.
water, and I'll see how that works. Why do we do this? Well, silicone is hydrophobic. It does not like water, so water tends to kind of bead up on its surface, and that can create air bubbles when you're pouring the plaster in. So this breaks the surface tension of the water to silicone kind of process, and it helps to avoid bubbles. It works really well.
Soapy water.
It works for me.
This guy should be in the pharmaceutical industry, right? I mean...
A quick note on the water that I'm using. The chemical reaction of plaster can be sped up or slowed down by the temperature of your water. The warmer the water you use...
You can also accelerate your plaster. I think you can, well, before 9/11, we used to be able to buy certain fertilizers. I think you can still get potassium nitrate. It's a little soil enhancer. And you take a little... We used to have 35 millimeter film capsules. I mean, this tells you how old I am. And we scoop that much, maybe 4 tablespoons, and put it in a 12-ounce bottle of, or 18-ounce bottle of water, shake it, and that would be accelerator. And then when I was mixing plaster, I would add a squirt of that to the batch, and it would kick that plaster off really fast, because I worked a lot faster than this. And I was like, damn it, I don't want to wait for this plaster.
The faster the reaction will happen. So I like to use ice cold tap water, very cold. It gives me just a little bit more working time.
Yeah, I didn't want that. I was like, get me out of here.
Mind when you're mixing up that plaster.
I'm like, I got other things to do.
On these mold straps.
I need to go to Subway, get a sandwich.
Universal mold straps, and as you may have guessed, they are used to strap molds closed. Now,
Okay.
you can use large rubber.
Where do you get these? Where do you get all those rubber bands and these straps? National Art Craft is a hobbyist dreamland. Their website used to be really hard to navigate, but this is where all things from China land for the hobbyist.
Bands like this to hold your molds closed, but when molds get big like this, they hold a lot of slip, and that makes a lot of...
The straps themselves come in different colors. So the blue straps are a certain length, the red straps are another length, and this way you can identify it in a shop very quickly, and I think green straps are short, whatever. So that way you didn't have to cut them like I was recommending and dedicate them to the mold. It's a quick ID. The rubber bands I used a lot also, but they seem to have gotten pretty pricey, especially the larger ones. We used to send those out to customers, but I didn't use them in the shop.
Bands to their breaking point, and I want to use the safest things possible with big molds. That's really
Yeah, he's right. The big mold has a lot of pressure.
In fact, a common mistake with these mold straps is over tightening them. They're very strong. You don't need to completely clamp them down. And when
Yeah, you can crack a thin mold with these straps.
the tails of the mold strap behind the cam, because the little leverage cam can sometimes eat away into the surface of the mold.
I just used to put a piece of cardboard there. Like right there, I would slip a little piece of cardboard
Don't
right
have to
there.
go too tight.
That works.
Ta-da. A common mistake I make when I get into the
Okay,
flow
so he's got
of
that
plastic
K95 on. Remember, just put a piece of Kleenex between the mask and your skin. I had really sensitive skin, so
This
I
is
was
a
always
disastrous mistake because you start adding plastic,
getting a rash.
have not compensated for the weight of the water, and it throws everything off. So always triple check to tear the scale before you add your plastic.
We got it.
Come on.
I didn't use digital scales for water. I just used the quart indication lines.
A quick note about plaster and how I store it and why I store it this way. So plaster, just
We
like
did this already.
one ring wants to be found. I do remember a long time ago, I went to this thing called NCECA. It's like this ceramics conference. And I went there
Haven't heard that in a
to
while.
look at the molds of a fellow by the name of Mitchell Spain. And
Ooh,
let me
we
tell
should
you,
look at
that
Mitchell
guy
Spain.
can make some molds. And I remember looking at them in person and thinking they look even better in person than they did online. So what I'm getting around to is he wrote a book, and I can't recommend it enough.
Wrote a
I'm gonna put
book?
a link to it in the description for this video. I learned a lot about how to best this plaster, and he made me a
That is a satisfaction-less process.
So check out that book.
To write a
I
book.
recommend it enough. Doing plaster in your studio, you do not want any plaster.
He's talking while he's slaking over in his bucket over here.
I have a two-step protection that I do to keep all of the plaster.
Two-step protection.
It starts with the plaster box.
Does he work for the government?
And that is the 5-gallon bucket of water that I keep next to the plaster. I use this to rinse out all my tools. I shave the molds into them. I sand the molds.
Well, he doesn't give a shit about his floor.
Of the plaster from my mixing buckets.
Yeah, floors take a hit.
And then this water eventually gets sifted and dumped out where it's not going to go into my pipes. And oh man, it's time to mix plaster. Okay, we are at plumbing ground zero. I have just rinsed out a bucket that had a little bit of plastic.
It's interesting. So the time that I was in the culinary industry, and actually Chicago Culinary Effects is the business that I still own. It's in the culinary world for food shaping. I was working with some world champion chefs, many chefs, and in competitions they were so restricted on their time that some of the ones that were at this level of pharmaceutical attention, they would almost map out their steps in the kitchen in that competition time because they didn't want to waste the steps. I think if this guy put a GoPro in his corner, I know he's making content at the same time, so we got to give a little love for that, to say the least. But there's a lot of back and forth happening that in my layout of the shop, I could do 6 things at one time because we would time them, and I would watch my step count. It's not like I'm perfect at it, but I wouldn't walk across the room with empty hands. I would always be moving something back and forth on my journey.
Right down the drain.
And it was just reflex.
No. Why? Because I've got a plaster trap. This is the plaster trap. It is a bucket that lives underneath the sink, and it operates on the principle that plaster is heavier than water. So any plaster that comes
Yeah, just don't rinse wet buckets, man.
Number 10. Okay, yeah, so
We did this. I'm getting tired.
I've run out of my long mold straps.
Bonus tip.
Shorter mold straps, and that means I don't have enough to loop back and protect the mold when I tighten this cam. So I just use little squares of foam core, put them in there,
The foam core disintegrates. Use cardboard.
keeps the mold safe. A freshly finished mold. It just so
This guy's like a marathon runner.
has a shipping scale that can handle the weight of a freshly cast mold, and here it is. All together,
I used to just I would carve the weight in the mold because you can't write on silicone, and I didn't have the wooden boxes to write on.
Extra water in this mold. Most of the water has...
If you carve it into the mold, you'll always know what the pour weight again is.
Body, and some
okay, wait a minute.
Continue to bond with that gypsum.
It's nice to have a mold drying area in a warm environment with the kilns, but some people will get their plaster too close to the kiln, and if you get your plaster over 100, 125 degrees or something like that, I can't remember the number, but it starts to degrade the mold itself. If you heat dry it too much, you weaken the plaster. The other thing is he's bending at the knee with some heavy molds. I would just get those Costco wire racks and be able to push these things around, and that way he's stacking things up, and he can put a fan to move some air underneath there. But he has his own way. I had my own way, but I just was tired at the end of the day. I wanted to leverage, not
in this
squat.
It's just got to evaporate away into
nice job
before we can use it for casting. How much water?
He's got some wood under there for airflow.
A
little nighty-night.
And this mold has dried
on the home stretch, man.
Over the course of 2 weeks.
24 pounds and 8 ounces. Your eyes do not deceive you. That is a difference of 11 pounds and 11 ounces. 11 pounds of water. You have to throw into the air. Now, if you think about it in terms of gallons, that is 1.4 gallons of water per mold. And we got 10 molds.
So that's a lot of water, and it's all got...
This is the closing part where I want to share the love, because what he's doing is not easy. He's making multiple camera angles. He's keeping his shop extra clean for the film. I think that this is really terrific. And he actually really, really cares about the things that he's teaching. He's not being careless in any way whatsoever. He's being thoughtful. He's assuming that everybody watching is a beginner and needs to know the basics. I think there's room for moving on past the basics, which I'm desperate to do. You know, this is really terrific. I see why people like his stuff. Personally, my only thing would be I would like more just easy tiger sort of stuff here, but his molds are beautiful, and I think he's very fussy. Now, the thing about the fussy part of it is, don't think that this is the only path towards mold making, that you have to have all of these things. You heard me say it before. There's a much simpler way if you're okay with that vibe. Some people really want to have control to the highest level over their workshop environment. I liked that when it happened, but it was seldom. The control I was hungry for is when I started having employees, because we needed standards. But myself, I could make my way through it, and I could be a little rough around the edges and still push out precision. And I think that there's something here that I wonder if he would be this fussy if he wasn't filming. Like, I'm not sure how much is for the camera and for the teaching and how much is just really him. I don't know, but I got a lot of appreciation for the things that he's done and a lot of other videos, but they're exhausting to me. It's not a criticism, it's just so much. You'll cut that out probably. Okay, B-roll when you don't know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I like that was exhausting.
It's so exhausting.
I know, we need donuts.
If you ask us, what does Michael do at the plaza while we're working?